Well, thanks for coming. I'm Milton Curry. I'm Dean of the School of Architecture here at USC, and it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you this morning to our symposium, Architecture, the City, and Democratic Capitalism. And I'd like to first thank Nancy and Ned Fox for their generous underwriting support that's been provided by the Nancy and Ned Fox Urban Design Critic Endowment. I'd also like to thank Jeffrey Von Owen, who really did yeoman's work in helping to get this conference symposium organized. So thank you very much, Jeffrey Von Owen, along with my research assistant, Grace Sillo, who is currently attending her classes today, but helped communicate with all of the panelists and helped organize the symposium as well. And also thanks to our lead staff in communications and events, Elizabeth Held, Assistant Dean, and Dee Dee Robinson, Events Coordinator, for all of their work in helping to put this together. So let's give them a round of applause. USC Architecture is a dynamic platform for educating and inspiring citizen architects, designers, and scholars to analyze problems and create design solutions that both respond to the challenges of our time and embrace the promise of a better built environment. For 100 years, USC Architecture faculty and graduates have pushed beyond the traditional boundaries of the field to pioneer many paradigm-shifting new practices of architecture. Now in our 100th year, the school inaugurates 3 consecutive symposia exploring some of the major issues confronting our time and our discipline. Architecture, the City, and Democratic Capitalism, here today. Technology in the Public Sphere will be a symposium that we'll host next semester, and Mechanisms of Social Control in the fall of 2020. Architecture, the City, and Democratic Capitalism explores the tenets of democracy based in capitalism and the contemporary implications of that system on the development and ideation of architecture, urban design, and landscape. We've come to understand John Rawls's idealized version of the egalitarian society as articulated in his theory of justice as a singular blueprint for resource distribution to achieve the most equitable society. Yet new work in political philosophy on egalitarianism reveals vital cultural work in flattening social hierarchies, recognizing the nuanced intersectionalities in play vis-a-vis class, race, and other identity factors as even more relevant and urgent than the redistribution of resources. To quote my friend and former colleague, philosophy professor Elizabeth Anderson at the University of Michigan, egalitarianism remains a useful framework for examining the contemporary metropolis because it contains a theory of value based on both the inherent equality of individuals and on some notion of a fair distribution of resources to individuals. Egalitarianism is thus a more ample construct through which to view challenges and opportunities of today's modern metropolitan regions because it does not assume a market-based or capitalist-driven imperative. Rather, egalitarianism can be used to ask, what if the underpinnings of resource distribution, transportation, housing allocation, and industrial and waste management were in the service of the most equitable allocation of goods and services? What are new and promising areas and scholarship being worked on by philosophers, humanists, architects, political scientists, and others, end quote. The collective future in the urban life spheres of the global community require a shared prism from which to understand basic human rights, how to distribute limited resources, and how to prioritize what different humans value. This need not be an American-centered epistemological construct. Thus, the decentering of such questions from an assumed elite positionality, whether that positionality is nation-state or universal globalist, is integral to establishing new ideas. The late curator, Okwe and Weiser, In his framing for the prestigious international art convening Documenta 11 in Kassel, Germany, states the following: crucial to the narration of modernity in our time and the formation of subjectivity, ethnic or national, individual or collective, an important qualification needs to be made, which is the extent to which current tendencies of democratic governance are inherited from and connected to the traditions of Western conceptions of democracy. But because it cannot be denied that the state of democracy around the world today has become more varied and flexible, we're moved to question whether the notion of democracy can still be sustained only within the philosophical grounds of Western epistemology. Our symposium will answer all those questions. Our symposium convenes leading thinkers to discuss three interconnected topics that relate to these observations on egalitarianism, the city, democracy, and capitalism, from different disciplinary perspectives and representing overlapping knowledge fields, to, in a sense, ground their thinking in the physical space of the city and in the lived experiences of diverse inhabitants of cities across the globe. We're doing that through three distinct panels. The first is income inequality and community reinvestment. The second is housing, displacement, and justice. And the third is planetary warming, technology, and resilience. Each moderator will frame their panels in their own way. We also look forward to the keynote address by Professor Scott Kurashige. So in closing, we're also really interested in the innovative research and insights, but also in pedagogy. How do you teach this stuff? How do we get students excited about going deep here and not staying on the surface? While keeping it real, keeping it relevant to the impact and immediacy of making impact and seeing change within a semester, within a 4 or 5 year degree, within their professional careers. So again, thank you on behalf of the School of Architecture and the university for coming, and I look forward to great conversations as we move throughout the day. Thank you. Frank Muscara, who was going to chair and moderate our first panel, has had a family emergency, so he's not able to join us today, unfortunately. So I'm going to pretend to be Frank Muscara, who's really accomplished, had a really accomplished career in banking, so I'll do my best. But I want to introduce our first panel and get us moving this morning. And as I said in the introduction, the first panel is focused on income inequality and community investment. Basic income, heard a lot about that, right? The right to housing and the right to the city. Are these ideals whose time has come? Or are they inimical to the capitalist credos of individualism? What are the consequences for conventional real estate development and public civic infrastructure for cities? Again, our panelists will have all the answers to this. Starting us off, and I'll introduce the panelists, but their bios are in your program, so I won't go into detail. Juliana Uhuru Bidadanure, an assistant professor in philosophy at Stanford University. Andreas Christopoulos, director of the Yeshiva University Real Estate Program. Annette M. Kim, associate professor and director of the USC Price School of Public Policy Spatial Analysis Lab. And Martin Muoto, CEO of SoLA Impact Fund based here in South Los Angeles. Each will present for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion, and we'll integrate the Q&A from you all in that discussion. So thank you, and I'm going to ask Juliana to start us off.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here. As Dean Curry said, I'm an assistant professor in philosophy at Stanford University. I'm in general interested in the kinds of questions that Milton raised just a few minutes ago, because I work on egalitarianism and the right way to conceptualize the notion of equality. Why is it that we care about equality? What is the right way to think about equality? But I'm also the faculty director of the Stanford Basic Income Lab. And I've been interested in universal basic income for over 10 years now. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm just going to make sure that this clicker works. But I think it does. Yeah, perfect. Right. So universal basic income is a policy that has a long history. It has some of its sources in Thomas Paine's Agrarian Justice. It was came of interest to Milton Friedman in the 60s in the form of a negative income tax. Martin Luther King also pushed forward a version of the universal basic income proposal, which at the time he called guaranteed income. But then it wasn't very much debate after that in the US for quite some time. And that changed about 3 years ago when a lot of personalities in the US started putting forward universal basic income as a response to what they saw as being the risk of AI and automation massively displacing workers from the labor market. So here we have some of them, Andy Stern, Rob Reich, and Martin Ford, the futurist. There is even a presidential candidate now that's running on a universal basic income platform, as you know. Now, there is a lot of resistance to universal basic income because it's pretty much the idea that people should be given cash without means test and unconditionally. So imagine $1,000 a month for all, no strings attached. Now, the resistance comes mainly from the fear that if people were to receive cash, no strings attached, they would stop working. When we ask most people, what would you do if you were to receive $1,000 a month, every month, no strings attached, most people say that they would continue to work. But when we ask people, what do you think other people will do if they receive $1,000 a month, no strings attached? Now their answer is very different. They think it will be a disaster. People will start watching Netflix all day and take up drinking, and the economy will collapse. So one important question is, what does the evidence say, right, about what people do when they are given cash unconditionally? And thankfully, there is a lot of evidence because universal basic income experiments and unconditional cash transfers experiments have been conducted throughout the world in countries as different as Finland, Kenya, India, Canada. And, you know, spoiler alert, people don't drink more and they don't watch Netflix all day. We know that people do not withdraw en masse from the labor market. And we also know that people do not waste the cash on temptation goods like alcohol and cigarettes. Now, there are also a lot of areas of uncertainty, right? So first, these findings are from different places at different times, and it's not always clear whether we can derive from that a clear sense of what would happen, let's say, if we were to introduce it in the US at the state level, the federal level, or even the city level. And second, economists have been particularly interested in labor effects, but there are many more interesting questions that need to be answered about universal basic income and what it could do and not do around stigma, crime, health, education, gender equity, racial equity. But excitingly, many of us are working on a new phase of universal basic income experimentation in the United States, and so hopefully we'll find out more soon. So Y Combinator research is actually experimenting universal basic income. They are giving 1,000 individuals $1,000 a month for 3 to 5 years in 2 sites in the US. They started with a pilot study in Oakland, and they have a budget of, I think the last time I checked, it was $70 million. The Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration under the leadership of Mayor Tubbs of Stockton, California. It's a much smaller pilot with 100 recipients that are going to receive $500 per month over 18 months. They've actually released some of their first findings a few weeks ago. And this one is a smaller scale experiment, but a very interesting one because Mayor Tubbs really sees it as an opportunity for his community to ask deep questions around deservingness and what it is that we owe each other. An even smaller program called the Magnolia Mothers Trust in Jackson, Mississippi, is giving 16 mothers $1,000 a month for 12 months. And in part, they want to try and challenge myth around benefit recipients, and especially racialized and gender tropes around benefit assistance. And there is also the Chicago Resilient Families Initiative, which is a task force that was assembled in 2018, proposing that 1,000 families received $500 a month. Now, 2 years ago, at the Stanford Basic Income Lab, we convened city leaders and experimenters from throughout the country, including many of those that went on to start experiments, to think together about what UBI experimentation and implementation could look like in the US. And one thing that came out of this is a toolkit that we called Basic Income in Cities that brings together existing evidence, highlights different models of experiments, and makes a list of concrete recommendations on how to set up a pilot. So I hope that some of you will be able to check it out. Our views is that cities can be laboratories of change and experiment the visions that we so dearly need for our future. American cities are already experiencing some of the changes that AI will bring to our economy, and they are ready to find creative ways to make their communities come out of these changes empowered rather than marginalized. And I think that supporting local communities in these bold and utopian and yet evidence-based attempts to invent a future that works for all of us is one of the most promising pathways to a human-centered economy. Now, I would like to take a step backward and really spend the rest of my time really thinking about what exactly universal basic income is and what is it that we are hoping to achieve when we push for something like universal basic income. Universal basic income is a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without means test and work requirement. So first, it's a cash payment, right? So it's not an in-kind payment. It's not a food voucher. It's not a benefit delivered in kind. It's given in cash, which means that you can spend the benefits as you see fit, right? So you can use it for rent, for food, for leisure, for savings, whatever you think is best. And of course, for that reason, it's been defended by a lot of philosophers over the years as an instrument of freedom. The idea is that not only do we want to expand your opportunity set and your ability to make choices, but we also do so in a way that's trusting of individuals and of their inherent ability to know what's best for them and for their families. There is also the idea that it's more dignified to let people decide how they want to use the money as opposed to giving them, for example, a food voucher. Now, there are many cash-based programs that are already in place throughout the world. Job seekers allowance in the UK, minimum income schemes, cash transfers. But what's different about UBI is that they are not household-based, they are not conditioned on particular behaviors, and they are not targeted. And I'm going to explain what this means. So universal basic income is individual. It's not household-based, which basically means that the eligibility is not defined at the household level. That means that an individual without a source of income of their own, living in a rich enough family, would still be eligible for universal basic income when they are not currently eligible for benefits. And that's very important because many economic dependents find themselves without source of income of their own. And that's a lot of research has been produced on, especially in abusive relationships. Financial dependence makes it extremely hard for people to exit an abusive relationships. And so for that reason, universal basic income has been defended, in part for that reason, as an instrument of gender equality. So in some sense, the push for universal basic income is a push towards more individualized benefits. Universal basic income is unconditional. Now, for many benefits recipients, they need to show that they are unfit for work, that they are unemployed through no fault of their own, and or that they are doing their best to find employment. Right? So there's really this idea that you need to show that you're deserving of those benefits, either because you can't work or because you're really trying hard to find work, but you can't find one, and you need to show that you're doing your best. And there are two reasons to explain why most of our benefit systems are centered around that. One is activation, the other one is deterrence, right? So activation pretty much means we want to get people back in the labor market, and deterrence is we don't want people to stop wanting to apply for benefits. We want them to try and find other solutions than that. Now, the government of Finland has actually contemplated introducing universal basic income, precisely because they feel that the current system isn't quite working for activation at all. And that's because of the phenomenon of benefits traps, right? So a lot of people who are on benefits, and that's true in many countries in Europe, lose their benefits the minute they accept an offer of employment. Sometimes those jobs are precarious and they end after a month or a month and a half, and then people are back to zero with the benefit systems, and sometimes they are left for several weeks without the benefits they need to survive. So there is actually a benefits trap or an unemployment trap where people end up finding themselves with a disincentive to go back to work. So the government in Finland, counterintuitively, is considering universal basic income as a way to encourage people to work more. Now, there's also this idea that if we live in societies where there isn't full employment, as has been the case for a long time now in many countries in Europe that have considered UBI, we need to stop punishing individuals who find themselves without work. We need to stop designing our systems of benefits in a way that's punitive when we know that the sources and the causes for unemployment are in part social. Universal basic income, because it's unconditional, gives people the freedom to say no. We've seen earlier to abusive relationship because it gives them exit options, but also to say no to jobs that are degrading, abusive in a number of ways. It also increases bargaining power because individuals within those positions can now have more options of exit and so can demand better working conditions. Universal basic income also increases freedom to say yes. So it's not just that you are able to opt out, it's also that you're able to say yes to opportunities that you couldn't say yes to otherwise, like looking after a child or an aging parent that needs your support a particular year. It enables you to do volunteering work if that's what you want to do. It doesn't require you to be constantly available for any jobs in the labor market. You can make your own opportunities as well. Last point I wanted to make, universal basic income is for everyone, right? Every member of a community. And so, of course, the question is, why give basic income to the rich? That doesn't make any sense, right? Now, of course, most universal basic income proposals are funded in large part progressively. So even though everyone gets it, some people are net beneficiaries and some people would be net contributors. But there are exceptions to this. So one example of basic income-like program that's often put forward is the Alaskan Permanent Fund Dividend, or Permanent Dividend Fund, which gives to each Alaskan resident a few $1,000s every year. And there it's not progressively funded. It's funded off a foreign sovereign wealth fund. But most UBI proposals are progressively funded. So the idea of giving it to everyone is first to increase access by changing the default, right? So currently take-up rates for benefits that are targeted are very low, which means that a lot of people who actually are eligible are not getting those benefits. And that's partly because those systems are very bureaucratic and very complicated administratively, and so some people don't end up claiming those benefits, but also because there is a lot of stigma attached to being a benefit recipient. So to give you an example, in France and England, in the UK, sorry, we think that only 40% of people who are eligible for the minimum income scheme that's in place there, in fact, end up receiving those benefits. So the idea of changing the default, normalizing public assistance, is really to make sure that no one falls through the crack. But it's also about destigmatizing public assistance, trying to change the vision or the message around public assistance and the idea that some people are unduly or unfairly free riding on benefits. Right? So we need to challenge that demonization of benefit recipients, and one way of doing that is to just normalize public assistance. There is a very interesting experiment, which is called the Minkum Experiment in Dauphin, Canada, that looked at what happens when an entire community receives benefits as opposed to just those who are seen to need it and to be deserving. And what seems to be happening in that experiment is that people change their perspective on public assistance from viewing it very moralistically to viewing it pragmatically as a stepping stone that enables everyone to live a better life. And finally, and this is going back to the kind of the history of universal basic income, it's often been defended by, especially philosophers, as a right of each member of a community to a share in the wealth that's produced in common, by all of us in common. And if that's the framing of UBI, rather than welfare in a sense, then this is really about equity. It's really about making sure that everyone gets a share of what we've inherited from previous generation and what we commonly produce. But it's also an instrument of social cohesion, because it's a way for us all to make clear that we have a stake, a common stake, in the way and the direction that society is taking. Okay, I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Andreas Christopoulos, and I'm an assistant professor at Yeshiva University and the director of the real estate program there in New York City. I'm here to talk to you today about the idea of risk transparency in commercial real estate and how this fits into the more broad-based topics which have been outlined in this symposium. I think will hopefully come through. From my perspective, the work that I'm involved in is in the domain of trying to understand, I'm just checking my clock here, trying to understand how different measures that we can construct scientifically may help us understand how to formulate expectations with respect to risk more accurately. And I think that when we think about the recent events of the financial crisis, we would say that during that period of time, there had been, prior to the financial crisis, one set of expectations with respect to value of commercial real estate properties and what that implies about people's understanding about their tolerance for specific types of risk. And I think that post-crisis, what we find is an environment where there has been a greater acceptance that there was substantial miscommunication about specific types of risks associated with commercial real estate that were not well understood. And in the post-crisis era, one of the words that's come up that has been extremely important for people to latch onto for true reasons as well as for political reasons is this idea of transparency. And the transparency has become this catchphrase for sound decision-making in the post-financial crisis era. Anyone from the Dalai Lama to Elizabeth Warren have been advocates vocally for notions of transparency, and in so doing, hope to create an environment where the effort to engage in actions which allow for greater transparency are things that are welcomed. Thing is that, so we have a regulatory perspective out there that says that regulation is important to enforce and enhance transparency, and there are very many people in many regulatory agencies, the OCC, the Federal Reserve, and the Consumer Financial Protection Board, all of them engaged in scientific activities to seek to provide us with greater transparency into a very large market. The problem is that transparency means different things to different people, and that without having a clear understanding of what we mean by transparency, we may get lost. And so we think of it from the perspective of looking at the risks and trying to understand risks, but really we need to have some sort of basic framework or basic definition that provides us with a way to move forward. From my perspective, as a person who's involved in evaluating commercial real estate risks, I too feel that transparency is important to the area of commercial real estate finance. But the question then is, how would I might define it? And so what I would say is I think that transparency can be defined as risk revealed, that the idea of revealing risk is central to the notion of transparency. But really, what does that mean? And so that is hopefully what we try to come up with and disclose some of that discussion today in this talk. The domain we're operating in is an $11.5 trillion market. That's 25% of a $43.5 trillion market, which is the area of all structured finance securities, mortgage-backed securities, commercial real estate, or CMBS, asset-backed securities. At this giant domain that the commercial real estate the commercial real estate endeavor participates in is quite significant. It's a very large environment. And the institutional lender community that's involved in actually making loans to individual property owners to either roll over those property risks or to go and acquire new properties or to repurpose those properties or to construct new properties in some part, some way, shape, or form are going to be governed by the capital markets, which are quite large. And these lenders have responsibilities to the constituencies that they're involved with to ensure that there's integrity in the actual lending process and that ultimately that the actual lending process reflects the risks of the underlying properties themselves. So when we think about from a commercial real estate perspective, what we're looking at is in terms of set of expectations, those expectations can be isolated into one variable, where that variable in the commercial real estate market can be isolated into the cap rate. The capitalization rate is simply going to be equal to the ratio of the operating income to the value of the property. And that the idea is that if I understand what the value of the property is and I understand what the net operating income of that property is, then I have a metric which is normalized across all properties in all places that should give me an ability to compare the risk of one specific type of property to another. We think about the idea of public information that's out there that helps inform people's decisions. And we say to ourselves, is actually the information pertaining to the risks of the geographic location of the property, are those risks actually coming through? And so we have here a time series that shows us for example, the net from the NCREF, which is one of the larger indices out there in the world that provide us with an insight into the capitalization rates through time. And we can see that we have different capitalization rates, but generally speaking, they oscillate. There's a correlation amongst them, and there certainly are distinctions between them, with lower capitalization rates associated with higher property values, and the converse is true as well. We thought one of the things that does not come through from the actual metrics that are actually used is actually the risks associated with macroeconomic indicators. And we thought that because of the fact that the current paradigm utilizes a set of indices that are split between the nation, the states, and regions, which there are 48 different subsets across the United States provided by the National Council of Real Estate Investment Fiduciaries, that those capitalization rates, which are indexed, may not necessarily provide us with insights into the actual risks of the geography itself, and that they are coarse to the endeavor of trying to understand what's taking place at a more micro-geographic level. And with that lack of granularity, and since indices themselves are going to be utilized in the formation of expectations by investors as well as underwriters, we thought we might be able to improve or to enhance this particular set of indices by going to a more micro level. Now, the idea is that we want to join what we would call supralocations, or the supralocations that are at the national level, or there are 48 split between the nation, the states, and the regions, and to join them at what is the more granular metropolitan statistical area level. There are 402 metropolitan statistical areas in the United States. And we seek to join them in a very egalitarian way by creating a measure called economic proximity. So the general idea between economic proximity between supralocations and more micro and metropolitan statistical area locations is that we want to come up with a way to join the supralocation with the MSA. But that joining is not going to be geographic ex ante. That joining is not going to be geographic proximity. That joining is going to be economic proximity. And the economic proximity we're going to define as through the use of a Euclidean distancing methodology as the difference between the supralocation and the MSA location for both house price indices as well as unemployment for every single MSA at every single time step. And what we want to do is to find the location intuitively that minimizes that distance, such that if I said to you Alaska for some reason has a house price index value and an unemployment value compared to, let's say, Miami, if those differences between them are very, very small, then the suggestion is that maybe the actual health of the actual economy in those places that's been projected onto commercial real estate properties should also be very similar. And so what we have here is this idea of Euclidean distances that are going to be constructed for the purposes of seeking to go through the nation and compare those differences and to find amongst all of those differences the match that's the minimum. And the minimum across all of those distances is going to be the match which says that there's a similarity that takes place between the super location and the MSA location. And what we find is that in fact that procedure is very, very powerful, because what it does is it flattens out the question and removes the geographic bias that exists ex ante. And by looking for that minimum distance, what we find is that we use the entire nation. What we see here as a graph on the right is going to be a sweep across all time on the x-axis, and then across all MSAs on the y-axis. The colors that are shown in there are going to show for you the relationship between each of the MSA locations and all the geographic locations at the super location. And we can see that there's no direct pattern, that they actually change over time. So the procedure itself allows for the full use of the entire nation without introducing an ex-ante bias with respect to the geography. Once we find that minimum location, we then utilize ordinary least squares that's computed prior to this to determine, based upon the relationship for the dependent variable of capitalization rates with explanatory variables of house price indices, unemployment, the credit slope, and a few other more global economic indicators, what we find is that we're actually able to construct something which does not exist in nature. What we construct are synthetic capitalization rate indices at the metropolitan statistical area level. And that itself, to be able to say we've constructed something out of nothing, is one of the main contributions of the paper. But who cares if you actually construct something out of nothing if it has no actual usefulness, right? If it's something that's just completely arbitrary, does it actually mean something? In fact, it does mean something quite important. And what it means, or it seems to disclose, in looking at 25,000 actual property values that measure roughly $75 billion, what we were looking at over a 15-year period is whether or not synthetic capitalization rates provide greater insight into the risk of lifetime default on commercial real estate properties over this sample period. And what we find is, using a logistic regression, what we find is that within central business districts where we have many comparables, that New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, within those central business districts, the synthetic capitalization rate indices are doing just as well as the expertise provided by lenders. But outside of central business districts, where there are not comps and where the vast majority of loans are underwritten, we find that there is zero explanatory value with respect to the capitalization rates estimated by the actual underwriters. And in contrast, sharp contrast, our synthetic capitalization rates find high predictive quality with respect to the actual risk of lifetime default. And so in closing then, so I've only got a couple of minutes left, what I would say to you is that with this main result, we feel very comfortable that the actual notions of approaching or trying to appropriate greater positions of transparency for this sector are bright, and that we actually think that this actually has great merit going forward. And in particular, it has great merit if we think about further extensions to this. And so if instead of looking at the MSA level, if I wanted to look at the county level, for example, where there are more than 2,000 counties in the United States, that this itself would provide even greater understanding as to actually providing insights into the risks and the implication of those risks for further research in the area of banking and actual risk setting. One area that this actually becomes very, very important is in the behavioral area with respect to thinking about how we would actually simulate economies and then simulate borrower behavior through time. And this is simply an expression of the formation of the expectations along a Markov chain. Ultimately, where you go with this is the actual ability then to transfer simulated values and understand what those simulated values mean compared to market assessments, where the graph on the top shows the market assessment of risk and the graph on the bottom shows the partitioning of those risks into their components. And so these are the areas of extension, and I think that transparency from a from a risk-setting perspective and from a societal perspective is very, very important. And I think that understanding where the science interacts with formulating sage understandings of risks is helpful for everyone involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Curry, for the invitation, and I'm excited about the challenge you've put forward for us with such different epistemologies, political philosophy, financial modeling, and I think you're really pushing us to have architecture reach out into these different worlds that are operating, very much impacting our city. So I will introduce yet another epistemology, which is a humanities approach. I think we've heard about the role of income, financial institutions, and egalitarianism. I'm going to talk about space, spatial justice, and I think I was also, and to situate these issues in our contemporary historic moment. So these issues of spatial justice given the machinations of our real estate markets, but also the huge demographic shift occurring right now in our historic moment of urbanization. So the conditions are changing. And you also asked us to address the implications for architecture pedagogy. How do we teach this? And so the main point that I will make, and I'm often invited to talk about this at architecture schools, is to teach designing spaces for people, to learn more about who are the peoples, that there's not one singular public, and that we actually need to learn about actual peoples and actual places. So I'll show things from my research. I think there's a lot of interesting possibilities, one, because of our digital technology capabilities, but to do it with a humanities approach, not just a computational design approach that's disconnected from what's going on in real with people in space. So I will show some of that, as well as what I call cinematic mapping techniques. Is mine queued up here? Okay. Okay, so the power of our visualization systems. Architecture teaches so much about the visual and how to represent the city. And this is an image from when I was a jury member of a master plan competition in Ho Chi Minh City. Major design firms come present these images. And this is the way we often teach how to conceptualize the city as an object from afar, an aerial view. And our systems of representation are so important because they shape what we should pay attention to, what we should notice, and also make other things invisible. So here's another submission, and Ho Chi Minh City's a mega city of 11 million people, and you start to realize the conventions we teach, there's not one person in this picture. It's really privileging the architecture investment, where will the FARs be allowed to go higher? And when there are people, there's sort of these generic people, and they're usually shopping and wandering in the city, and they're all kind of the same generic people. This is a photo of actual Ho Chi Minh City, how incredibly densely populated it is. And, I should have said, in the last image, we designed for this class of people so that they can recreate, including that bench, but as you can see here, no one's sitting on that bench. So there's this disconnect between how we think people live in the city and the way people actually live in the city. And again, these generic peoples, we have them as velocities of mass moving in space. But embedded in those regulations are assumptions about who these people are. This person is going to do pleasure walking, normal walking, shopping, and go to public events, right? So, it's very important to look at space as formal space, as physical space, but also we need to know about space as political space, social space, how we construct it. And so that's what I see we need more of a mirroring. And, our ideas of a public space often come from the Greek tradition, but even back then, people are critiquing that was only if you were basically not a slave male could you participate in the public sphere. And I'm going to run through quickly, there's been a reconsideration of who is in the public. The importance of public space is very politically important. It allows public speech, but the inclusion of who we imagine is in this public. And again, the importance of commercial space as spaces of meeting and having public sphere talk as well. And so here's some more images of disconnects of how we think we design in the city and how people actually use space in the city, crossing, people who don't have cars, people who need wheeled access, and so they break through private property to make the most direct access. So it's kind of an anthropological approach to think about who is in the city, how do people actually need to live, and are we designing for them? So not only is there a disconnect of what's going on locally, but we're part of a huge historic shift right now of mass migration. And I think it's leading underlying condition of the political anxiety sweeping the globe, of new people coming in our midst and having to share space with them, questioning our very identity, our entitlements to place. And most of this has been most dramatic in the global south, where there's been millions of people coming in, fellow citizens who also don't have full right to be in the city. And it's corporal as well. We're getting more crowded. People are trying to eke out interstitial spaces, and so I'm showing some images from around the world of the more underclass, marginalized people who cannot buy in the market, and instead are in informal markets that have emerged to meet their needs. So what this means is one of the underlying conditions that we all need to respond to is we're in this historic moment where we're challenging our very property rights of who is entitled to space and what are the conditions and liabilities, responsibilities that we have to each other. And so here are some more images from my research. One of the ways to get at this, because a lot of these new migrant populations are made invisible, and yet they could be 30% of the population. In Beijing, where I took a sabbatical year, of the roughly 23 million people, there's about 1 million people living underground in basements and bomb shelters. And we were able to map this because we could scrape the ads, the informal market from the internet. So we have these capabilities now to better see who is in the city and their needs. And essentially, if you're not familiar with this, the incredible amount of construction happening in Chinese cities, in certain cities with the geology to support it, there's a whole underground layer because by code, every building has to have an underground layer. And so those were made into, for a time, subdivided into little housing units and mostly inhabited by migrants. There's also in Shanghai another project we're doing where it's hidden informality. A lot of people touted China's urbanization as one without a lot of sprawling squatter settlements that are typical of rapid urbanization. But what we found is it's hidden within the formal environment. So we went into some high-risers. There's a whole group rental market. This is when we went into an office tower and we opened the door and there were 40 beds crammed into the 2-room office. And there's a whole market again, and we mapped that from the internet as well. And this is not an isolated condition. Now we're hearing about intense crowding in interstitial spaces in global cities around the world. You know, there's a real issue about finding space for everyone. And this is also, I'm doing more recent work in Los Angeles about displacement and gentrification issues. I'm going to go quickly through these. For me, one of the, I think, core political question is who belongs and who's entitled to space in the city. And that's one of the things we're working out and having a contest about. So I just, in closing, show 2 projects, or 2 videos of my most recent project. It's the first time I'm researching the United States. I'm remapping race and ethnicity in Los Angeles, and trying to come up with new ways to think of mapping and understanding space in the city, to not just map from top down as reified static objects defined by boundaries, but that the city is very dynamic, contingent, and keeps fluctuating. So And in this midst of dynamism, that people are really eking out a space that they can say they belong to. And so one of the things we did is we manually went through the city council files and saw all the petitions by citizens saying they want an official city sign recognizing them. And this is sort of a timeline of different groups, but there are many other kinds of signs. And where are they spotting their location? And it's not tied to residents, right? So the importance of often commercial spaces or other kinds of institutional spaces to make places of belonging. People are kind of communing to their place of belonging, that the neighborhood they live in is not defining who they are. Because people in the US often move 7 times in their lifetime. And to think harder about mapping, a lot of the racial segregation maps have been based on residents. It's 4 racial categories, and it's basically the same map. This is UVA, this is New York Times, this is Washington Post. And while it's a very real phenomenon, our system of capitalization through your home is very significant. There's other, it felt it was a truncated narrative. And so one of the things we've been doing in LA is to, we created a process over the last 2 years of gathering all the street view images along major streets in Los Angeles and isolating the text in order to get a sense of where are these places of belonging. So here's a little video to explain that project. That's pushing us to harness our new technologies to see better. To not, again, privilege the same kinds of data sets that we already have. But I'm also cognizant of the limitations of this method. We're just seeing the exterior. I think it's still, it's important to define what exactly we have. I believe the signs speaking to us are creating a sense of place, and we need to study that more. But it's also much more complicated, the phenomenon that sign is representing. Who's the owner? Who are the customers? Who is the landlord? And especially the deep complexity in Los Angeles. So we also do cinematic mapping, where we go in and do a more ethnographic approach. So one great example here in Los Angeles is Bill's Taco House, which I'll show you. Originally started by a Mexican American, so on our sign we would have probably coded it as Mexican, but it's actually much more complicated, as you will see. Okay, so I think one of the things we've been learning through examples like this is core to the question, how are we going to live together in this city? And what I learned from this example is they are in their own worlds and cultural spaces together, and that this kind of really important Black place of belonging is co-produced, that we all share a stake in creating these places of belonging. And kind of awkward beauty of what that looks like to live together. So thank you very much for your time.
I'm Martin Muoto. I'm the head of SoLA Impact Fund. Can everybody see me? Great. We are a double bottom line social impact fund that invests exclusively in Los Angeles and primarily in South LA. I'm very fortunate and very lucky to be here. As I looked at the backgrounds of the other panelists, I was certainly the least educated, possibly the least academic accomplishments, but I feel very lucky to be here. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about why you are also very lucky to be here. So how many people here today feel lucky? Raise your hands. Fantastic. That's the right answer. I'll tell you 3 reasons why you're lucky, and it relates to what we do, and it relates to democratic capitalism, and relates to a number of things that we're dealing with as a society and as a country. I grew up in West Africa, and I came to college 30 years ago. I actually applied to USC and got in, but because I didn't have any money, I didn't get full scholarship, and I required a full scholarship to go to any university. When I applied to universities in the United States, I actually couldn't afford the application fee. Literally, I couldn't afford the application fee. So my principal wrote a letter that said, listen, this is one of our best students, and please consider his application with no application fee. So you know a lot of those ended up in the shredder. And being in a university like USC in LA everybody here is incredibly lucky to be at such an esteemed establishment. I got into the University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School of Business, and my career primarily was in investment banking and venture capital, and I came out to LA in 2004, 2005. I started to invest in real estate on nights and weekends using my own money. I ended up finding and discovering South Los Angeles, and it was very interesting because very few other investors were paying attention to South LA. For a number of reasons, I thought it made a lot of sense. And I did a lot of analysis, not as sophisticated as some of the analysis that's been done here, but looking at things like cap rates, pro forma cap rates, price per square foot, price, gross rent multiplier. And I looked at this area called South LA, and I hadn't spent almost any time in South LA, but I was like, these numbers are off the charts. Why are people not investing in South LA? And I spoke to dozens of brokers, and they said, whoa, you listen, you don't know what you're getting into. You're going to go to South LA, you're not going to get paid, you're going to have a lot of evictions, folks aren't going to take care of the properties, so on and so forth. And I said, let me see for myself. So I found about 30 properties, and I went and drove all 30 properties. The listings would say, do not walk the properties. I would walk the properties. They would say, do not disturb the tenants. I would knock on doors and talk to tenants. And I just found this dynamic, thriving culture in South LA. And my investment thesis was quite simple. It was that even in tough areas, the vast majority of the population are good, hardworking people that want a safe place for their kids. And if you gave them a very good product, if you gave them a really respectable home, a high-quality apartment, they would take care of it. And that investment thesis has borne out in spades. And so about 6, 7 years ago, I raised our first fund. It was a $10 million fund. I was surprised that anybody would give me money to go out and do this. I was not a professional real estate investor before that. We did a $10 million fund, bought 265 units in Los Angeles, in South LA primarily, I think about 35 buildings. And then 2.5 years ago, we raised our second fund, which was a $55 million fund. And we have bought 130 buildings, 1,200 units, again, predominantly in the greater South LA area, some units downtown, some in Echo Park. And then earlier this year, because of some interesting developments in legislation, and we'll talk about that in a second, we raised a $100 million fund in 6 months, and we're investing that almost exclusively in South Los Angeles, South Central Los Angeles. So the first reason that I was lucky was that I was able to come to the United States through the generosity of a higher academic institution. The second was that I discovered Los Angeles, and that's the second reason that all of us are here. I don't know where the clicker is, but Los Angeles is such a dynamic and thriving city, and we are very long LA. So the fact is you have a laboratory here, you have a community here, you have a city here that is just on a dynamic tear, in some respects hasn't been fully discovered. There's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of issues that LA is facing. All the issues that us as practitioners and academics and citizens are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. That's homelessness, that's income inequality, that's gentrification, that's immigration, that's criminal justice reform. The fact is, we are able to be at the front lines of all of that. And I feel incredibly fortunate because that is our headquarters. We are based at 86th and Vermont, in the heart of South Central Los Angeles. We are 9 blocks from where Reginald Denny was pulled out of his truck and started the LA riots, right? We are close to the 110 freeway. Literally, we are right now close to the 110 freeway, which was for those of you who know the history, Freeway Ricky Ross was perhaps the most notorious drug dealer in all of America back in the 80s and trafficked in crack cocaine up and down the 110 freeway, and hence he got the name Freeway Ricky Ross. So we are in the midst of all of that. We're also dealing with the challenge of a community, particularly in South Los Angeles, that has been stigmatized, right? That has been stigmatized with all of the issues that came out of that era, the crack cocaine era, the LA riots, and so on, and we're still living with some of that stigma. And so as I started to invest in this area, a lot of the perception was what was holding other investors back from really understanding, investing in, and building opportunities in this community. The third reason, so the first reason you're lucky is because you get to go to USC. I'll tell you, my brother went to USC, so when I would come from Philadelphia to visit him, I was always like, oh my God, what did they do? What did I do wrong? Because I was in dreary Philadelphia and came out to see the wonderful campus here, and I felt that he was lucky, but in hindsight, we were both very fortunate. The second is that you live in one of the most dynamic cities. And this chart talks to some of the long-term trends that are tailwinds in LA. We're going to get the 2022 Super Bowl, the 2026 World Cup, the 2028 Olympics. And so all of these things are going to drive incredible change and incredible opportunity in this community. And the third reason that you are incredibly lucky is that you are led by a dean who gets it. And is he here? Oh, he is. You're led by a dean who gets it and understands that architecture and the practice of architecture and the discourse in the architectural field has to be really in the context of the community, and is doing, in my view, some incredible things to make sure that perspectives from different backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds get incorporated into that, and believes that architecture should not be done in a lab, should not be done simply in the ivory tower. And I'll tell you, that perspective is what is critically needed, both in the field, but for us as practitioners, for us as developers, we want that perspective. We want to incorporate bright minds that are dealing with those challenges and incorporating that perspective. And he's doing some incredible things to make that happen. So that's the third, really important reason that you all are very lucky, and I'm lucky to be here. Let me talk about some of the things that we are doing in SoLA and how it may relate to sort of democratic capitalism. Look, on one hand, we are, as a country and as a society, certainly dealing with a massive vacuum of leadership. It's another reason why we are somewhat lucky. There is a curse which says, may you live in interesting times, right? And we certainly are living in interesting times today. And part of that is this vacuum of leadership. And I believe, and I think that a lot of very informed leaders believe that part of this is that capitalism in its historical form is broken. And if there was a recent article by Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce.com, talking about how capitalism is broken. Ray Dalio, who is the managing partner at Bridgewater, talks about how capitalism is broken. And so some incredibly wealthy, very informed people are saying, look, the system isn't working. And so there's this vacuum of leadership as to how it needs to evolve and how it needs to work. One of the tools that we believe is going to be very important is this area called the Opportunity Zone legislation. The Opportunity Zones got introduced about 2 years ago, and we were able to take advantage of that legislation, but it's really going to lead to a tremendous amount of capital coming into communities that have been historically neglected. And it is something that architects, developers, financiers, community leaders, nonprofits need to really be involved in, because we believe that the Opportunity Zone legislation is going to drive a lot of capital in this area, and it needs to be done responsibly. and it needs to be done in the context of what the community needs. I'm going to skip over a few of these things, but fundamentally, our view is that the investments that are needed in these communities have to really meet a number of purposes. We are unapologetically a for-profit company, but our very close, one of our main priorities is that we have to see social impact in the investments that we make. We want to make sure that our tenants' lives and the community benefits. And therefore, our motto is doing well by doing good. It's not just a tagline, and it's not doing well and doing good. It's actually doing well by doing good. And I'll just give you one anecdotal data point. Last year, we gave out $10,000 of scholarships broadly to our tenants. We weren't sure that we would get enough applicants, so we invited anybody that was vaguely related to our tenants, their friends, their family, and cousins and whatnot. And we gave out a number of scholarships to very well-deserving students. This year, through the generosity of our investors, we gave out $100,000 in scholarships to, again, the community through a lot of our nonprofit partners. And the event was actually held right here in this room. There were 27 just incredible kids that likely would not have pursued higher education, had we not at least helped them along that way. But invariably, after we give away these scholarships, we start getting applicants to our apartments that are not our traditional applicant. They have a slightly higher FICO score. They have a little bit, longer job tenure and whatnot. And I asked one of the women that was applying to our buildings, how did you find out about SoLA and why are you applying to the SoLA building? And she goes, look, I heard that if I live in your building, my kid can go to college. And I was like, whoa, not quite. Our marketing may have gotten ahead of ourselves, but it showed you what a drop of water can do in the desert, right? What she heard was that there was a landlord, there was a developer that wanted her kids to go to college. So I'll end with a few things just as to all of you in the architecture school, for the colleagues that are here. This is an incredible opportunity. We're living in incredible times. We're living in interesting times. Right outside these doors, right outside the campus, is one of the greatest opportunities and needs in any urban city in the world, in one of the most dynamic cities in the world. And so I really encourage all of you to embrace the challenge. You're incredibly lucky to be here, and you really have the opportunity to put your fingerprints all over how the city and this community is going to be developed. We're a part of that, and again, we are just very privileged to be part of the discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. I want to start by trying to link all of the really brilliant observations and research from the panelists, and then start with a question. So the linkage might be that that in order to compensate for some of the miscommunications in the marketplace due to statistical and economic measurements that are not what they should be, in order to compensate for a vacuum of leadership in public policy or in public finance or in community development, that we're coming up with new and innovative ideas, structures, metrics, matrices to develop the kind of community, develop the kind of urbanism, develop the kind of cities that are more ideal, that are tracking more to the perspective of notions of equity. If that is the case, which it might or might not be, then I want to ask, maybe starting with Andreas, because one of the questions is how do we get here? How do we arrive at this point, at this conversation? And I want to ask a pointed question to Andreas that you can take in different ways, but do you think that the failures that you described and the way of looking at the marketplace through your research lens would have averted some of the deeply catastrophic consequences for human capital that emerged as a result of the Great Recession, particularly for low and moderate income homeowners?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I think that, you have a dual priority, there's a dual issue with respect to thinking about real estate investment. It's the initial need to actually demonstrate that it's a profitable enterprise and that it has longer-term social impact and social benefit for the constituency that it seeks to serve. And I think that, from my studies at least, early on in the financial crisis, you had a lot of potentially really good intent with not necessarily the best science behind it. So I do think that better measures and better statistical analyses that allow for assessment of those risks early on, and to couple them with, as many of us on this panel have been discussing, to couple and try to derive measures for the long-term benefits for the area which the either construction or repurposing of buildings takes place, to really try to if not necessarily reprioritize that, certainly incorporate it into the prioritization in a quantifiable way. I think those are things that can and should be done. And we're living now in an era, stated as of yesterday, with quantum computing. It's like it's not going to be difficult to actually compute whatever it is we want. We have to just figure out what it is that we need to compute and to do it in a way that's meaningful and useful. So I'm very optimistic. I just think that I would never hesitate to indict the past and say that there was a problem there, and it of course becomes emotional when the problem is one where it's very good intention, but potentially very bad science gets coupled with it. And if you have good science in conjunction with good intentions, I think that overall things should improve considerably.
Okay, so one of the things that we need as a community is public investment, public goods, and I'm wondering from Martin or Juliana or Annette, where should the investment come from, based on different classes of real estate, so to speak? So I'm assuming the public space or the quasi-public space within your apartment complexes are paid for internally, but public space that, Annette, you showed in the renderings as well as in the real-life circumstances are paid for by whom? In Hudson Yards, something like a very large partially publicly financed development, the public space is not always public. And so what is the right mechanism for ensuring that public and civic space, as well as things that are categorized as public goods, are also robustly financed?
I think, to talk to maybe a practical example of this, whenever I go to New York, I have to go to New York often, and I always am amazed by the subway system. And it's not simply just because it's public transportation, but because the subway system in New York represents economic integration. I always find that it is amazing. You've got plumbers, you've got doormen going alongside of investment bankers and lawyers and doctors and professors. And it's such an important public space to see and to touch and feel different folks. And it's, we believe very strongly that if you can't see it, you can't be it. And one of the challenges is if kids in South LA are not seeing doctors and lawyers and, professors on a daily basis, they don't feel they can ever be those professions. And so I don't know that it answers your question directly, but I think that we believe that architects, developers, politicians, and all of the influencers have to be mindful of how to create real economic integration, which is, I think, counter to gentrification and some of the things that your research pointed to about sort of segregation, both economically and racially. That is critical. How we do it, I think it takes, look, we for a long period of time, I was very reluctant to engage with politicians. I just felt, having grown up in West Africa, you just don't want to deal with politicians in any capacity. But that's changed over the last year or so, and we're much more vocal and much more engaged with the determinants of public policy, zoning, and so on. And I think, again, the university and other stakeholders can do the same.
As you said, I think in our U.S. system, it's highly private, our city making. And even in these private spaces are where people in the public are living their lives. So I don't think we have this clear delineation of private and public that's as useful in practice from what I see. I think what it means is, though, that in regards to this topic we're talking about, we need space off the market. And so I'm really curious, Martin, do you buy market rate for your developments? Because I think that's one of the key questions, is having sites that it's wonderful, the affordable housing you're making, but to do it at scale, one of the key questions is, where would we get the space? And so I think there's a push for alternatives or to change those entitlements. There's community land trusts, there's new kinds of much denser living arrangements that different developers are experimenting with, seeing what people accept. And then the zoning of what you're entitled to do on that land, and that's a big live debate right now. You might have heard about Minnesota got rid of single-family zoning, allowing 3 units to be developed on a typical parcel. But then you have this huge community backlash of changing the aesthetic or a sense of place, or who's going to be in our neighborhood. And so I think that's kind of the political work, the social construction work of what we think, how we're supposed to live. Given many more millions of people in the city, so many people are still thinking we're in the 1970s, and we're drawing like it's the 1970s, or imagining that's how we should live. Another thing beyond residence is commercial, and so there's also been a move. We've been having talks here and also with the city of the role of businesses, legacy businesses, of with all the displacement and gentrification worries, that the sense of place often are the group of establishments there that create things like, Mariachi Plaza or Little Tokyo. So there's this movement to democratize heritage, which I find really exciting, that these commercial establishments do more than business. They're creating places of belonging for people. We want them to stick around, and not just by their pure market potential. And to think of heritage as more than a particular kind of architecture, but what goes on, again, with people inside them and the communities that use that space, and the role of ephemeral heritage that might not be property owners and yet have a claim to space. And how do we provide space for those ephemeral but really important cultural practices?
Juliana, you want to jump in?
Sure. So I guess I can answer the question as it relates to universal basic income, and where does the money come from is obviously a really big question in that context. And so I think we can differentiate 2 types of question. One is, how do you fund those experiments, the city demonstrations, those especially at the city level. And so far, the experiments have been funded philanthropically. And in the report, we explore a few other a mix of options for funding experiments, small experiments, bigger experiments. But of course, if you think about scaling up, charity is not justice, and that can't be the solution. And so, of course, many different funding proposals have been proposed throughout the world. In general, progressive taxation is, of course, part of the solution, but some people have advanced a wealth tax or financial transaction tax. In Switzerland, there was a referendum on the universal basic income, and what was the main funding source was a consumption tax, especially on luxury goods. So people in different countries, in different contexts, have pushed for mixes of different funding sources. Another one that's very popular is the carbon tax. Of course, that would generate a very low universal basic income. And also there is a move, especially in countries that have natural resources, to try and set up a sovereign wealth fund and generate a dividend for all residents. Especially there's a movement to transform oil into cash for residents. So those are all like funding sources that have been considered. But I think it's also important to remember in that context the very high cost of poverty, right? So when people can't make a living, when people are struggling, there are enormous costs to society. Homelessness, health, all those crime, all those are areas where a lot of savings could be seen if people were just to be made a little bit less miserable. And then the last thing is that some programs would become redundant if something like a universal basic income were to be introduced. So some part of it would be self-funded. In Europe, for example, we have all those minimum income schemes in place, which are conditional and targeted. So those would be replaced by a universal program.
Thank you for a fascinating panel. I was fascinated both by what was said, but also by what was not said. And one word that was not spoken and whose absence was very striking to me in a discussion of egalitarianism and democracy and equity and justice in the ongoing project of settler colonialism that we typically call the United States is, of course, the word colonialism. If decolonization is not a metaphor, if decolonization means the rematriation of indigenous land and reparations for labor stolen from enslaved people, one question is, can real estate development and investment strategies or inclusive placemaking or UBI open up to decolonization? And a second question is, if they can't, what does it mean that when egalitarianism is on the table, decolonization is off the table?
I'll just get started, but I did say decolonize the map to the way we've been controlling space, and very much cognizant of what is not said in maps. And actually, our next cinematic mapping project is related to Native American knitting of interstitial spaces in the region. And just thinking about the incredible lack of education I received in public schools here about that history. And so we're partnering with school districts to have a new kind of education because, as Martin was saying, I think it's so important for people, the next generation, to have better knowledge. I think that's something I'm grappling with about how radical are you really? I think that's something that's discussed a lot in these gentrification debates of older school community development organizations being called sellouts by trying to create an inclusive capitalism when there's more fundamental change people are seeking. So, yeah, I think which project are you working on is a key question. And I guess each of us could talk about that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for your question. So I think for me, and maybe I could have spent a little bit more time talking about this, it's really about equity. I mean, I think some of the most powerful framings of universal basic income are about the fact that we all deserve a share in the wealth that we co-produce, right? So I think the notion of equity has to remain central. The notion of equality as well, in the two ways Dean Curry was kind of introducing in his remarks, right? So there's this idea that of relational equality, right? Relating as equals, living in a society where we are able to stand and relate as equals. And I really see this as completely linked to universal basic income and its capacity to challenge myth around deservingness and our very divisive rhetorics of the deserving versus undeserving poor, which, as we know, are incredibly racialized and gendered. So I think the prospect of universal basic income in challenges in those rhetorics of demonization make a universal basic income a proposal that's very much in line with relational egalitarianism. And then as you were talking about distributive egalitarianism as well, I think what's interesting about UBI is that it's redistributive, it's, in one sense, it's not much different from any other proposals that are redistributive, but it's also predistributive. So it's about not just trying to correct for an unjust system that generates inequalities, but it's about giving power to individuals to prevent the production of unjust and unequal outcomes. And that's in part through giving people exit options, which might increase their voice and their ability to say no, to exit, to bargain for better positions for themselves. So I think all of those connect with equality, inequalities in a variety of ways. And not sure what I want to say right now about colonialism in this country and egalitarianism, but definitely what I want to say is that there is a single story of automation around universal basic income at the moment, and I think what I find to be most promising is really a framing around gender and race, especially in this country, and how universal basic income enables, for example, the remuneration of both unpaid and insufficiently compensated caregivers who are in this country, disproportionately women of color.
I mean, a question to add on to Andrew's question would be, does basic income connect with and synergize with something like the right to housing or the right to the city? And what does that mean to particularly those in the economic and real estate spectrum? The right to housing, the right to the city. What does that mean? How does that get digested or absorbed within economic models that would, that would retain, the best qualities of capitalism and dispense with the more negative qualities of it from your perspectives?
Do you want to go ahead?
Well, I'll just make a couple of comments. The first is I grew up in a real colony, meaning that, Nigeria, I grew up in northern Nigeria and saw the impact of, colonialism firsthand, and obviously there are aspects of it in the United States. And as much as it may be a controversial point, there's good aspects of colonialism and negative aspects of colonialism. So it brought in a lot of education into a country like Nigeria, and then, when Nigeria sought independence very quickly, and the colonialism sort of structure came out quickly, you left, with sort of some devastating impacts that West Africa and most of Africa have been dealing with over the last 30 years, 50 years maybe, because it was 1960. So I think that my perspective governs two things, or is informed by two things. One of them is time frame, meaning that for private developers, it is really a push that we have made even to our investors to take a longer term time frame about things, right? To really look at it and live with the consequences of your decisions. So one of the things is I've never been a flipper. I've never believed in flipping. I never figured it out. Maybe I'm not that smart. It's that, we own and operate all of our buildings. We have never sold a building until, actually last month we sold 2, but out of 150 buildings we don't sell. If I never had to, I would never sell a building. I want to live with the consequences of my decision. I want to make sure that we operate those buildings and deal with that. So one is time frame, and the other is intention. And I've often heard, look, the difference between sort of the true aspect of social impact is about intention. Right now, you can't always dictate or regulate intention, but you can often judge intention and you can see it, right? You can't fake. One of the things I say is you can't fake what we're doing. Come down to our offices, sit in the waiting area. You'll see the challenges we deal with and the opportunities that we deal with and all of that. So, it's about trying to steer resources to folks with the right intentions and with the right time perspective, and some of that is ultimately going to be governed by the Darwinian process, which is there will be failures, there will be successes, there will be abuses, there will be success stories, and we just sort of have to be connected to all of that.
I would pick up on that point with respect, and thank you, and for the questions as well. So here's a story, right? At the end of the day, when you think about, from an investment perspective, for contributory forces for social good and how that intersects with commercial real estate investment, you still come back to the basic question as to what the source of the capital is going to be. And Martin makes the point, and I had made it before, with respect to the horizon, and that in people who are highly successful in the area of real estate investment, many of them are unlevered, meaning that they're not going to the capital markets to seek debt to secure the acquisition of new properties. So if you omit the debt ticker, meaning I need to go and service that debt with the performance of the property, and you have the luxury or framing, luxury would be a nice way of putting it, but maybe you don't, maybe it's not a luxury, maybe it's something that it's actually from a government perspective, it's not a matter of luxury, but rather one of priority, that really when you omit the debt capital markets from the discussion and you're engaged much more in a full equity investment, much in the way that you have national parks. I remember saying in the beginning of my graduate program at Cornell, I remember saying and getting involved in discussions of debt for nature swaps, and I remember having the idea that really what we need to be doing in Polo Amazonia is not having a discussion as to whether or not there is a right for Brazil to actually engage in engaging in timber, but rather really have to think about a notion of a global commons, and this is like a giant global national park that every single nation in the world has to contribute to for the benefit of the entire planet, right? So I remember thinking these things as being very, very important. I think in the context of what we think about from a commercial real estate perspective, if you have it, just to simplify the problem, if we say that we have a debt instrument that's actually going to be utilized for the purposes of acquisition, in the case of for-profit investments, I'm just not pointing to you for anyone, myself included. I used to manage a $3 billion portfolio for Nomura, and so ultimately it's like we're providing resources to people who are going to go as bankers, and we go and provide those resources to people for their investment purposes. Their investment purposes are not because they're sitting in some room saying, I want to collect all the bags of money, but they have actual responsibilities to their constituencies who have responsibilities to healthcare and providing actual resources for insurance and for additional compensation for endowments. And everyone who is actually investing with the investors is actually looking for some basic return. Some of that return can be in the form of good feeling. But ultimately, good feeling isn't necessarily going to pay the doctors that are in part being paid by the healthcare investors who invested with some hedge fund who decided to go and lever up and purchase real estate on margin. Now, Warren Buffett says, I don't care about the stock market. I don't care. It's a voting mechanism. I could care less. I have an investment horizon of infinity, just like every good government should have that perspective. And so I do think that the government has a role in thinking about it and helping us to quantify measures as to what the actual benefit, long-term, essential, long-term, if not, with a horizon of infinity benefit to specific developments from a commercial perspective, thinking about things that Annette was talking about with regard to the actual purpose of the social commons, even in the context of a commercial real estate enterprise, and also in the context of thinking about where housing actually has a broader benefit, as Andrew was asking for really at the end, in terms of what the broader benefit ultimately of is house ownership for the longer term benefit of the society. So I think those types of longer term perspectives are important. I do think the point of intersection that one has to contemplate is the differences in between equity investment and debt investment. I know for a fact that a $43.5 trillion market is not going to go away anytime soon. That being said, that's only one part of the equation. The other part of the equation is longer-term investment on the part of governments to actually facilitate that. If that means increasing taxes such that actually those increased taxes can be utilized for longer-term benefit, that's one way. You're not going to convince me that there's not other sources of capital within large industrialized nations like the United States that they can't actually figure out ways to help people if they think it's actually worthwhile. We have a public parks, fantastic program that took place after the Great Depression, specifically to help people get to work, specifically for the benefit of society and for their own benefit, their own feeling of being no longer sitting there and being left aside. And I think those things are important. With commercial real estate, I think the tricky part, again, is a debt issue and how we become and figure out ways to quantify that from a longer-term benefit.
Thanks. I appreciate the presentations this morning, but I want to make one general point, and it has to do with the university. We're here at a university, and a university such as the University of Southern California has lots and lots of resources. As most of us who are here have seen in recent years, University Village was completely rebuilt to house students, to have high-end shops and all sorts of other things. What used to be there, and maybe some people don't remember this, was a bowling alley and a movie theater. And this was nixed under former President Max Nikias. And I'm told, I can't verify this, that the rationale was it attracted the wrong kind of people. Now, if the University of Southern California cannot conduct a policy of development itself that actually breaks from the kinds of standards that have governed development so far, how are we going to expect developers to do any better?
Thank you. I'm going to just add to that, and you can answer very briefly because we're out of time, a lightning round question of do you believe that there is such a thing as enlightened capital?
No question.
Yes, I do.
Yes.
Hypothetically possible?
I love that answer, so I'm just going to copy that.
On that note, please give a round of applause to our panelists.